Warming bracket!
What's going on, everyone? So welcome to my latest video. This is of course a continuation of a series where I focus on a specific genre and I pick my 10 favorite of said genre. In this case, it's obviously my top 10 favorite superhero films of all time currently as of the making of this video. So I'm going to first give you guys some honorable mentions, and I want to say first right off the bat is that my number one honorable mention that I'm going to give first is actually one that I almost gave the number 10 spot to. The number 10 spot and honestly the number one honorable mention. I was flip-flopping back and forth. I finally decided to just leave it the way it is currently. But all that expectation aside, I'm going to give you guys honorable mentions and then obviously go 10 to 1. So let's get started. So the first honorable mention is Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition. I really like this film. I personally think it's very underrated. Next honorable mention is X-Men Days of Future Past. I think this is probably the best X-Men film personally. I do like First Class, but this one I think is much better. And then next up you have Kick-Ass, which is really good. I really dig this film. I think it's very smart, very clever, and one of the better superhero films. And then my last honorable mention is Glass, which ends the trilogy, and I think it ended on a high note. I personally really like the twists and turns, and I think that Shyamalan is back on form. I think he did a really good job with this film. It's not amazing. You know, it does have its fair share of flaws, but I do like the ambition of this movie. That's why it's one of my honorable mentions. Now, next up, guys, we're going to be going from 10 to 1. So let's get started with that. So my number 10 is Joker. Yeah, sure, it's a knockoff of Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, but it's so well crafted. I really do like this movie. I've seen it like 3-4 times. It's really good. I think it's a very strong movie. It looks great on 4K as well. So that's why it's my number 10. Next up, my number 9 is Black Panther. You'll be able to see a lot that most of these superhero movies I do own in 4K. Black Panther is no exception. I think this movie was very much so against the grain in terms of the Marvel formula. It had a great score, great cinematography. Both are things that Marvel has suffered from, as well as it also had a strong villain, another thing that Marvel usually suffers from. But this movie was really good. I don't get the backlash personally with this movie. I think it's very well made and definitely one of the better Marvel films, and personally one of my favorite superhero films. So that's my number 9. Next up, my number 8 is Unbreakable. Yeah, this is the first one in the trilogy along with Split and Glass. This one, I wasn't a big fan of the first time I saw it, but I revisited it in preparation for Glass, and I ended up really, really liking it. And I've seen it a third time. It was during the pandemic when I saw it a third time. And I really like this film. I think this movie is really strong. It's a different approach to the superhero genre. It's slow, meticulous, but it's very powerful. I think the movie works really well. And that's why it's my number 8. Next up, my number 7. Similar to Unbreakable, I had to watch this movie a second time to fully appreciate it. And my number 7 is Avengers Infinity War. The pandemic, man, it really brought out a lot of interesting traits in me. My rule of thumb usually is that I don't buy a movie if I saw it one time and I wasn't a big fan of it. But I broke that during the pandemic, and this was one of the big cases. I bought this movie on 4K. Seeing it only once in theaters and thinking it was just okay and having its fair share of issues. Bought it on 4K, watched it, and I really liked it. It might have to do with the fact that I also saw, obviously, Endgame in theaters and everything. I thought Endgame recontextualized a lot of things that happened in Infinity War. But yeah, Infinity War is really good. It's a lot of fun, but it also has such a great ending. And I do kind of think it's actually very ambitious with what it's going for. So yeah, that's why it's my number 7. Next up, my number 6 is Spiderman Into the Spider-Verse. One of the best animated films I've ever seen, but it also is one of the best superhero films I've ever seen. Combines a lot of different styles into a really fresh, invigorating take on Spider-Man, and probably the best take on Spider-Man, honestly. I really dig this film. I don't know how the sequel's going to fare, but I do know that this one, as it stands, it's a great film. That's my number 6. Next up, my number 5 is Avengers Endgame. Yep, that's right. I like this a little bit better than Infinity War, and I think it's because this is the film that made me say to myself, you know what, if it takes 22 movies that are generic or, a little bit above generic to get to this, I'm okay with that. Because Avengers Endgame is just, it's so satisfying. It really is. Like, it really does bring to end a lot of interesting characters that you've grown to know for the past 10, 11 years at this case. So it did such a great job of wrapping things up, and it was very satisfaction. I I remember afterwards, I was like, I don't know where they're going to go with this, like afterwards. And, after obviously seeing WandaVision, now currently Falcon Winter Soldier, I don't know if they're ever going to be able to top this movie in terms of Marvel, formula. I don't know, because it's a really good movie. It's 3 hours and it takes its time, and I really liked that. I thought that was something that was very different from Marvel as well. But I really like this movie, obviously, and it has such iconic, scenes at this point. It's great. Look to your left. So yeah, it's my number 5. Next up, my number 4 is The Dark Knight Rises. Yeah, this movie has backlash. I remember when it first came out, a lot of people were hating on it. Critics love it, and I 100% agree with the critics, honestly. I like this movie. I like its ambitions. I like how it's epic in scope. I thought it was very satisfying, which is a common theme you'll see on this list, because I also thought Endgame was very satisfying. This movie is very strong, I think, in rewatchability value as well. And not only that, I thought that it did such a good job of kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, in terms of what a third chapter in a superhero franchise could do. I thought it could have pushed it a little bit further, and I did actually do a video about that, but I still think it's a really good film. I think it's very strong. Nolan, man, he did such a good job with this movie, and yeah, I love this film. That's why it's number 4. Next up, number 3 is Batman Begins. My favorite origin film. I know some people are like, oh, Joker's my favorite origin film, and it's like, nah, Joker's a good origin story for sure, but Batman Begins, I think, is really what, for crying out loud, kickstarted so many different movies, taking this formula that Batman Begins would end up, perfecting. Casino Royale, obviously, took from this, G.I. Joe, several other movies. But this movie, I think, is still one of the best. It's just so great, honestly. I can see why some people might have issues with it, because in the third act, it does go into, like, action overload. But, something, I do think that action is interesting, and honestly, it is built into the character as well, with, like, it is tied to that drama. So I think it works for me personally, and I do think that the villain is interesting. Yeah, I love this movie. I think it gets everything right about Batman, and, honestly, Christian Bale did such a great job in this movie, and Nolan as well, in terms of directing. So yeah, that's my number 3. Next up, my number 2 is Watchmen. Man, I love this film. Similar to Unbreakable and similar to Infinity War, I had to watch this movie a second time, because when the first time I saw it, I felt very conflicted. There was a lot of, choices that the director made that I just wasn't a big fan of. 17, 18-year-old me just wasn't a fan of, but couldn't stop thinking about the movie. So I watched it a couple more times, and, now I declare it as a masterpiece, of the superhero genre. I think this movie is excellent, honestly. It works not only just as a superhero movie, but just in general as a film. And that's something that's important in notating, because Snyder did such a great job with this movie. I think that this movie is very mature in its approach, but it also is very thought-provoking, which I also like in my superhero cinema, and this movie definitely is that. Very underrated. I love this film personally. I'm definitely in the camp of being positive for this movie. I know that there's a lot of mixed things that people feel about this movie. I personally don't feel this. I love this film. I don't know it on 4K just because the 4K comes with the animated comics interwoven into the movie. And I'm just waiting for a 4K to obviously just have the director's cut, because the director's cut is what I love. I don't think I've actually seen the theatrical cut. But that's my number 2. Now, my number 1, I know, it's so, cliche, but I gotta say, I love this film. My number 1 is The Dark Knight, the film that changed superhero cinema forever, as well as blockbuster cinema, as well as the Oscars. The Dark Knight had such a huge impact on the film industry. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, just Heath Ledger. Like, Heath Ledger, if you take him out, you just have a generic crime drama. And it's like, I disagree with that 100%. Because if you implant any villain, you still have a great, story, because the story is essentially about pushing Batman to his limits, as well as just frankly about how Batman ends up having to take the blame and how he ends up having to go on the run and essentially throwing away the cape and cowl. That's something that fascinates me. I feel like not a lot of people talk about that. Like, the reason why this film is studied in, film classes, at least in the area that I live in, is because it deals with a lot of philosophical debates. I mean, that's something that's interesting, especially post 9/11. I just feel like not a lot of people give this movie credit that it deserves. I get it, a lot of people do love this movie, but then you also have backtrackers, which is fine. You can detract from this movie all you want, but I still think that people need to appreciate this film because it is great. It's got great acting, great action. Incredible cinematography, amazing score by Zimmer and Newton. And it's a great movie. It's got everything I want personally in a superhero film. Similar to Watchmen, it's very mature, it's very dark, and that's how I like my superhero films. I love The Dark Knight. On the back here it says, prepare to be wowed. I'm wowed every single time, and I've seen this movie at least 2 dozen times. And in 4K, it's outstanding. But yeah, that's my number one. Guys, what did you think of my top 10 favorite superhero films of all time? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as well as I'm curious to hear your guys' top 10 favorite superhero films of all time. Let me know in the comment section down below, and as always, with the subscription, notification bell, and I'll catch you guys later.